so let's now move into some more concretely, like how we can actually use these tools to study quantitatively and rigorously these kinds of ideas in first the mind at the cognitive level and behavior, and then somewhat at the neural circuit level. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about learning. We'll see what I have time for. So let's start with some intuitive physics, which is, I'll mostly talk about intuitive physics, a little bit about intuitive psychology, but this is sort of more basic. So going back about 10 years ago, we started studying these kinds of things in what are in a sense very classic, much older kinds of stimuli. These, you could call them blocks world scenes. We were in particular inspired by the game Jenga. So if you know the game Jenga, you might recognize this is about the size and shape of little Jenga towers, but colored in funny ways. But going back to the earliest days of AI, people studied perception, reasoning, language in scenes of simple blocks, maybe partly inspired by kids playing with their toys. Our interest was in studying where perception and physical reasoning meet up, and the ability that you have to look at these scenes and in a glance get a sense of their stability or instability. So probably we would all agree that the scenes in the upper left look stable. If I go away, they're going to still be there. But the scenes in the bottom right look like they could fall over at any second, or they should be falling over, but surprisingly are not, right? Would you agree with that? Okay. So how do we do that? Well, let's look at how we can build a model of your brain's ability to do that at, again, one of these software levels. So we're going to sketch or flesh out this diagram and show how it can solve this kind of problem. Okay. The first step is to take as input an image just at a certain point in time, or you could have multiple points in time, and you have to get from the image to the underlying world state. So that means something like this. Here's an image of one of these block tower scenes, and the underlying world state is something like this. Okay, well, this doesn't look all that different except it's colored in black and white, right? But it's just a picture. I'll show you a clearer picture in a bit of the inference that the system makes about the underlying 3D configuration of the blocks. The difference between the thing on top and the thing on the bottom is that's a pattern of pixels that's produced by rendering with computer graphics a 3D block configuration. That on top is a picture of the 3D block configuration. Now, the easier way to see that is to show you that this is just one Bayesian posterior sample. Namely, this is one good guess of a plausible input to a renderer under a prior that says, I think the world is, this limited world is made out of these blocks of certain sizes and shapes and could be oriented in various ways. So this has a very strong prior about the scenes, which is basically just what you see, that they're made out of these blocks and so on. But this is one good guess of a block configuration that would produce that image under a standard graphics projection. Here's another guess. Here's another one. So I'm going to play these again, and you can see, you see the blocks moving around a little bit? A little bit? Okay, so you can see they're kind of hopefully you can see they're sort of moving in 3D. Like they're not just changes in pixels, but the blocks are sort of shifting their position in 3D. Those are all just slightly different guesses that are all plausible guesses. If you just looked at that image in a glance, you couldn't perfectly reconstruct the 3D geometry, but you could make a reasonable guess like this. Okay, here's another example. This is a tower that's somewhat more unstable, maybe. And there's one guess. Here's a few other guesses. Again, do you see the objects kind of shifting around a little bit in 3D? Okay, so that's meant to represent the posterior uncertainty about where the blocks are precisely in 3D that your perceptual system is just has to live with, right? I mean, in principle, with enough time and enough compute and whatever, you could maybe perfectly localize this, but still there's ambiguity, there's occlusion. It's not, depending on the problem, it may not even be possible to exactly know. But certainly your percept is going to be only an approximate 3D configuration that produces, that's the input to a graphics renderer that would produce that image. So that's the first step, is a model that does that. Now, I'm not telling you mechanistically how we achieve that. There are different ways to do it. You could think about very general purpose, but somewhat slower mechanisms that are sort of top-down. And if you're familiar with MCMC or Markov chain Monte Carlo, a good general way to find the input to a function, given its output, given some strong prior, like a prior on scenes, is to basically do a kind of a random walk in the space of all scenes until you find ones that fit the data well. Traditionally, that's seen as being very slow and maybe too slow for how the brain works, although increasingly, with modern software and hardware, you can actually do that kind of thing incredibly fast, and for at least simple scenes like this, in close to real time. So it's quite possible, if we invested $80 billion in getting that kind of thing to work instead of in full self-driving cars, we might have a very different understanding of what you can do with Monte Carlo-based probabilistic inference. Even a much less investment has already made this kind of thing work much better. But another sort of thing you can do, and here's one place where neural networks come into this picture, is to train a neural network to do that inverse, to make a posterior guess given an input. You can do that, one of the standard ways to do that is by generating simulated data from the generative model. So imagining random scenes and then rendering them into images. So drawing probabilistic samples from your simulator. And then that gives you very good training data for just a standard supervised learning neural network that learns the inverse, that can now take the outputs of the graphics engine, the images, and predict the 3D configuration. In a sense, that's what a lot of training neural networks on simulated data already does. But under this idea that it's like the game engine in your head, that's a model of what could be going on inside the head. It's similar to an idea proposed by Jeff Hinton in the mid-90s that he called the wake-sleep algorithm. It was a way of sort of jointly training a generative model and a so-called recognition model, which is a neural network that inverts a probabilistic generative model. For Hinton, the probabilistic generative models were themselves deep neural networks, kind of like what we now call variational autoencoders, but they weren't trained end-to-end. For us, the generative model is one of these probabilistic graphics models, but still, you could train a neural network to be the inverse to it. And that could be, he called it the wake-sleep algorithm under the idea that maybe that's kind of what's going on in dreams. And I think that's still as good a functional theory of dreaming as anyone, which is that your dreams are your brain generating training data from its generative model that can train bottom-up inference recognition systems. And you can show that that can effectively solve these problems also very fast, as long as they're reasonably close to the prior. Okay. So those are several ways that you could implement this idea of inverse graphics. And now let's use that for intuitive physics. The key is, however you implement it, right, bottom-up neural network, feed-forward neural network, or sort of top-down MCMC, or there are also interesting hybrids, like bottom-up data-driven proposals that can also make MCMC much faster, or the MCMC can clean up. However you implement it, the output of that computation is a scene description which is both the input to a graphics engine, so it can produce the images that you see, but it's also the substrate of a physics engine. So it's a physical scene representation. All right, so now I'm showing the 3D interpretation with these wireframes. So maybe it's a little easier to see that they're 3D configurations. But the key is that that same representation is the thing that your approximate physics engine can run on. So I can simulate a few time steps forward and just sort of see what happens. And for this construction of blocks, which looks unstable to you, well, the way our model knows it's unstable is that it runs a few steps of the simulation and the blocks have mostly fallen or at least moved. Okay. But this is just one simulation it could run. Here's another one. Each of these is a different guess at a possible state and near future. And the difference between them is just that they start with a different posterior guess at the scene description. So the upper left here is one configuration of blocks that is consistent with that image. Not very. This is a fairly bad sample. This is a much better sample. But the point is, you could get it more right or more wrong. And the way our model works, and arguably, or our hypothesis is perhaps this is the way the brain could work. We have some empirical behavioral evidence for this. Is that you take a small number of these samples, maybe one, or at most in our estimates, maybe 5 to 7 of them, one or a few, of these samples of the block configurations, and then you run those forward a few time steps in your simulator, and you might get that as your output on the upper right, or you might get that. Notice the outputs are different because the initial conditions were different. But from the point of view of intuitive physics, it's basically the same. Namely, all or most of the blocks have fallen. So if you just count about how many blocks have fallen, even just a few of those samples is enough to make a pretty good estimate that, yeah, this is a very unstable tower. And that's the way we build these models, which we can then quantitatively compare with human performance over there on the left. So that scatter plot shows on the y-axis human judgments on a scale of 1 to 7 of how unstable a tower is. So the high one is very unstable, the low one is stable. You could get very similar data if you just had a 2 alternative forced choice task, stable or unstable, and just looked at how often people hit one or the other. Okay. It basically looks the same. On the x-axis, you have the predictions of the model, which are based on running a small number of these simulations and averaging the percentage of the tower that falls. So it's a graded notion of stability. It's like the expected value of stability. Okay. And you can see there's a pretty good fit for, in this case, we have 60 different stimuli. The crosses show error bars, like 95% confidence intervals. The 3 colored dots correspond to 3 particular stimuli, just to give you some examples of what might be going on. Very stable on the left, kind of medium, and then very unstable on the right. What I'm showing you here is an important baseline model, which is very similar. It has exactly the same underlying physics, but it has no uncertainty. So the one on the left, it's a probabilistic physics simulation. It has uncertainty that actually of 2 kinds. One is the state uncertainty from the perceptual system that I showed you, and the other is a little bit of dynamics uncertainty. It doesn't perfectly know the forces, exactly how strong gravity or friction are, or the possibility that there could be some unmodeled force, like a wind could come along or somebody could bump the table. So it has a little bit of uncertainty on the force dynamic side too. And it turns out that this kind of experiment is very hard to tell you whether the uncertainty is due to perceptual uncertainty or force dynamics. You can do other experiments to try to study each of those. There's probably each of those are in your brain. But some uncertainty is necessary, because if you take the same physics simulation with no uncertainty, you get a very much worse model of human behavior. The correlation, instead of being about 0.9, is about 0.6. Note, it's actually a better model of the world. Like, this is actually the correct model, in the sense that what it predicts is what actually happens, but it's a worse model of your judgments of the world. So this, in a sense, people sometimes look at the work that we've done here and they say, oh, you just think people are perfect at physics. No, not at all. Like, this is the perfect model, and it's a much less good account of people, okay? But the pattern of errors is also very diagnostic. So in a sense, the errors that people make are expressed by the points over here, especially that red dot in the upper left, where you're off from the y equals x line. Those are the points where people say it's very unstable, but the actual ground truth physics says it's stable. In fact, all those points on the left, all those lines there's no error bars on the x-axis because there's no uncertainty here, right? All of those ones correspond to things where people think, a lot of the blocks are going to fall, some or all of them are going to fall, but the model says, nope, none of them move at all. In particular, the red one, people think it's totally unstable, it's the most unstable, but actually it's just perfectly balanced such that none of the blocks move. But what we would argue is that it's sort of a physics stability illusion. Your brain thinks it's unstable because, in some sense, generically, probabilistically, it is, right? Under any reasonable probabilistic estimate of the state and dynamics of the world, that should be falling. It's just that in the actual particular one, it isn't. But because your system is probabilistic, then it's going to see it as incorrectly unstable. And in fact, there's sort of this asymmetry. You see how the plots are in the deviation from y equals x is in the upper left, not in the lower right. What that means is that we tend to see things as unstable, which are actually stable, and not the other way around. And that's really interesting. That's an interesting prediction of this model, which seems to be somewhat true. It's very different than I'll show you in a second. Well, here, I'll show you right now. You could, as a contrasting model, you could train a deep neural network, a convnet, that some very good AI researchers did a few years ago at Facebook AI. They trained basically a traditional deep convolutional net, similar to the ones that you've seen provide good accounts of some aspects of the ventral stream. They added some other parts to it to make it more predictive of future states. So it's kind of a little bit like a little dorsal and ventral, if you know those ideas. But the key is that it was trained to predict how the pixels would move and also to read out stability. And if you train it on these scenes of these like 4 cubes, it performs super well, better than humans. But interestingly, it completely misses these physics illusions. So what you can see here, if you watch this, like that one right there, you see this will repeat this loop. But you'll see things like that one where it's very confident there's a low green bar like that. There's many scenes which the model is like sure is not going to fall over, and in fact it doesn't fall over, like that one. But don't you think that should be falling over? Now that one is falling over, but like that one, shouldn't that be falling over, right? But the model says nope, it's not, and indeed it isn't. So the model's like too good, right? I would say that's because it's probably overfit on the training data. It's trained on 200,000 examples of those scenes, and there's not that many different ways that 4 cubes could appear. And another sign that it's kind of overfit is that it doesn't really generalize. So it can generalize to like 5 cubes, but it doesn't generalize to 10 cubes, let alone a lot of things that aren't cubes, or many other judgments. So I think it's a nice kind of contrast, and it shows you, again, what you can do easily with machine learning, but also what you can't do. Okay. In contrast, the models we built, you asked the question about learning. The model that we build here, with no learning at all, is able to do many different kinds of judgments. Not just will the stack of blocks fall, but the very same model can be asked which way will they fall, or how far will they fall. And what you're seeing here with those sort of polar coordinate thing is an interface we use with human subjects to get their judgments. And it can account pretty well for these judgments. Although not so much for how far will they fall, but there's an interestingly good reason for that. The question of how far will they fall is actually the one thing we've studied in this domain where the simulation-based models I'm talking about don't work as well as a simple visual heuristic, either for the ground truth or for your judgments. And I think there's basically a good reason, because this is just not inherently predictable by simulation. But just estimating like the height of a tower, it seems that when people ask how far will they fall, they just look at the height of the tower, and the taller it is, the harder it will fall. But that actually turns out to be like the only really good, efficient way to estimate that. It turns out a simulation, because of the chaos in the system, just can't actually estimate that. So that's interesting too. It shows some of the ways that your intuitive physics is adaptive. It doesn't just use these simulations. We can ask questions like this, like suppose the gray stuff is much heavier than the green stuff. So notice that these two towers have the same geometry. We've just colored the blocks differently. And if you know that the gray stuff is a lot heavier, then you'll make a different prediction about, say, which way the blocks will fall, as you can see here. And people make those different predictions, and so does our model. So because of the way it's built, because the underlying physical state has parameters like mass, you can just tell it that the green ones are lighter than the gray ones, or vice versa, and then it can easily incorporate that information. Okay. I tell it to you with natural language. We tell it to our model with a little tweak in the programming language. But though I'm not a linguist, like the hypothesis would be, this is what your language system does, is it translates the words into some formal representation that can set the appropriate parameters in your physics model. That itself, by the way, is quite plausibly done by a neural network, but I'll leave that to some other people to talk about. Namely, the way the language system could possibly translate from a string of words to some underlying semantic representation. But again, maybe that will be covered later on in the course. You could also use this thing to make judgments. These ones are a little bit more sort of Bayesian. Suppose you see surprising data, like these towers look like they should be falling, but they aren't. You could make an inference backwards about which color is heavier or lighter than the other to explain the surprising data, and the model can support that too. I'll show one other kind of judgment, which I like to do, and it's a nice, fun little interactive demo. Because unlike these ones, these are all, I think, sort of familiar judgments, especially like, will this thing fall? We've been making those judgments effectively since we were like those babies that I showed you at the beginning. We have lots of experience, if not in Jenga block scenes, although some of us are expert Jenga players, but anyway, we have lots of relevant experience. But consider this judgment here, which unless you've seen me give a talk on this stuff before, you've never done this task, because I only just made it up for the purposes of this talk and other presentations. But you can still answer this question, just like you can answer all the others. So suppose this table is bumped hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor. Is it more likely to be red blocks or yellow blocks? So again, I'm programming your mind with the task, not by giving you a data set with inputs and outputs, but by giving you a statement in English that your language system can translate into a query that can be evaluated on one of these simulations. The hypothesis, I'll show you, illustrate this in a second, is that you kind of run one of these simulations, look at the outcome, and sort of ask whether it's more red or yellow blocks. The very same thing that can do the stability can do that. But just forget that mechanism. Just look at this and say, what do you think the answer is? Red or yellow? Okay, good, red. How about here? How about here? How about this one? Longer pause, that's important. How about here? Okay, so yeah, almost everybody's saying the same thing, but not all, and maybe especially notice like those pauses, what's going on in that? Well, again, I'm not really showing you the data to this, but there's a long history of research studying the relationship between reaction time and confidence. And when people take longer, it's a sign that your brain is less confident. It also would be associated with that. If you had to respond on a fixed timeline, you get more probabilistic responding. And it's a sign of some process in the brain that accumulates evidence, internal evidence, we think, from one of these mental simulations. If you can run just one or a couple of simulations and they all tell you the same answer, then you can respond right away. But if you have to run more simulations and kind of get more internal sampled data, it's going to take you longer. So here's a little illustration of the mechanism for one of the easy cases, not the hard cases, but an easy case, where I will just run a very small, okay, so there's one bump. Boris said, I didn't tell you which direction it was, but for the easy cases, it doesn't matter. So there's one bump from one direction. I also didn't tell you how hard the bump was. Here's another bump from, I think it's the same direction, but it's harder. Notice that the precise outcome was different. The blocks fell in different ways. But from the standpoint of intuitive physics, it was the same. Namely, all the yellow blocks fell, fewer none of the red blocks. Or similarly, if I only show you the first few frames and I can stop it in time. Come on, run. All right, well, tried to stop it soon. You can see that you only have to run a few frames. You don't have to go to the end to know what's going to happen. So just a small number of simulations for just a few time steps, and it could also be very approximate. You don't have to model the dynamics very accurately, is enough to answer these questions at the grain of intuitive physics. This is a plot of the same kind of thing. Human data, human judgments of how much red versus yellow on the y-axis, the model's predictions from a small number of simulations. You can see that it fits almost as well for this judgment as for this much more practiced judgment of how unstable the tower is. So it's a sign, again, I think, of how much you can do without task-specific learning, right? Both in your brain and in the model. Okay? That's our hypothesis, at least. Now, I'm not, again, though this model did no learning at all, specific to the tasks or at all, I'm not saying that your intuitive physics engine doesn't have a lot of learning to get to the point that you have today as an adult. But we'll talk more about that at the end. This is just a little bit of a teaser for examples of cool projects in robotics that I and some students with me collaborated on. I certainly wasn't the driver of any of these projects, but it's interesting that these ideas of intuitive physics are starting to be quite influential in robotics, in that you can try to put these ideas into robotic planning systems, and they can do all sorts of cool things that would be much harder to do if you tried to, say, build a system, like build a traditional program that doesn't have a physics simulator in there, or if you just tried to do the whole thing with end-to-end learning, okay? So it's really an alternative to either of the standard ways of doing robotics, you might think. And that includes, like, actually you saw there for a second a robot playing the game Jenga. Here you have some really cool work from Mark Toussaint that Kelsey Allen and Kevin over there, or over there now, collaborated on, which was getting a robot to use a little bit of physical reasoning to flexibly use tools. This is a simulation, but the robot is able to figure out how to use tools to achieve its goals, like get the ball, including clever multi-step plans, like use one tool to get the thing onto another thing and then use that, or use a hook to get another hook. These are the kind of things I showed you some videos before of crows, or there's other animals with chimps or other great apes doing this kind of thing. And it seems that our best way to get robots to do that kind of flexible tool use is also to give them intuitive physics. These are examples of systems that can learn to walk, like this soft body walker here. It learns to walk not by a kind of reinforcement learning, but by having a sort of a physics simulation of its own body, and by just optimizing the muscles that achieve a goal. So it's, again, another way of having like a physics engine in the brain of this robot or in the head that allows it to learn to walk not from trial and error like reinforcement learning, by just kind of, it's a kind of optimal control. I mean, in some sense, I don't want to oppose this to traditional robotics. In some sense, a lot of traditional robotics uses physics-based models with optimization to build control policies, but we're increasingly able to get this to work in really interesting complex settings like this kind of soft body robot, or things that are increasingly more like biological systems. Yeah, I mean, it learned with a gradient-based optimization or convex optimization or something, I don't know, yes. Yeah, and it learns in a I didn't check with the video, but it learns in relatively like 100, pretty fast, 100 iterations of optimization. Yeah, well, that's why I did the red and yellow block task, because you don't have any direct experience doing that task, though you do have experience with blocks, but yeah, sure, of course. There's various ways to do that behaviorally. Like, The most interesting way to do it is to teach somebody something that they've never learned before and then study how they generalize that. That's pretty hard to do because if you show somebody any stimulus that's natural, it's always related to something they've seen before. Like, I'm not showing this here, but I think some of you have seen this, like these TUFA objects that we show, where we've studied like one-shot learning of novel object categories. I can, with computer graphics, create an object that if I said, what is this? You'd say, I don't know because I've never seen anything like that before. And then I can teach you a name for it, and I can show you other similar things, and you can recognize that, yeah, they should be called the same thing, and we can build models of how that works. But as Gabriel is saying, it's not like I've never seen anything at all like that. I've seen objects before, and it still has like surfaces, and there's a lot that can transfer from what we have seen. And I think in many people's work, including in our work, probably the only way to explain how we can do that, how we can see 3D physical objects, is with some component of learning. But I would say it's very general learning. It's not learning to see chairs or dogs. It's learning to see surfaces and how surfaces relate to volumes. But the way we study that is by giving people things that are as novel as possible, right? Here, some of the ways we study generalization are, yes, there's generalization across tasks. There's generalization across, stimuli. So the way we study generalization across tasks is doing like what I showed with the red and yellow thing, where I give you a task that you've never done before. But as you say, there's a lot of, the physics is all shared with other things we know. So the way we can study generalization there is, for example, I'm not sure if I'll have time to show this at the end, but we can sort of take the physics and introduce some novel force or change the physics in some way and see like how much data do I have to give you and how much can you generalize. And maybe not surprisingly, we can also generalize very strongly if I introduce a new kind of physical phenomenon or force. Just to take two familiar examples that you are aware of in your own life. Think about, for example, magnets. Like, I don't know if you remember the first time as a kid someone showed you magnets, but you can learn very quickly. I mean, it's cool and mysterious, but like, okay, you have these pieces of metal and there's like this mysterious force, but you can figure that out really quickly and then use it productively. So for example, once you understand that some of these things attract other ones and some of them repel, you can like push things around or pull them, or you can do these clever tricks like put one thing on the top of the table and put something else and like make a magic trick and move it around. Those are examples of generalization that happen very quickly from learning a new force. Or for example, think about the first time you saw a touchscreen device, like a touchscreen phone. Probably you're still old enough that when you were babies, they didn't have those. I don't know. I lose track of these things. I think so, right? At some point soon, I won't be able to say that. But certainly for me or Gabriel, right, we did not grow up with anything like pieces of glass where you swipe your hand across it and suddenly things happen. But it only takes one or two examples to basically learn how that works and to use it. And you're sort of like, oh, wow, okay, I guess if I move my hand across this, things light. And if I swipe this way, it goes this way. If I swipe that way, it goes that way. So that's an example of learning, in a sense, a new kind of physics, or learning about remote controls, right? So the basic kind of physics that infants have doesn't allow action at distance, or rather the prior is for contact causality. But I can learn about like these things which I point at other things, and if long as there's some line of sight or pointing, I don't know what the intuitive theory of remote controls are, but something like that, then I can make something happen at a distance. You can learn that very quickly too. So those are other ways that you can study generalization. We've studied with kids, we've studied how they learn about magnets. We haven't studied remote controls or touch screens, but that's another way you can study generalization of physics. You can also say, suppose I introduce like really novel, weird shapes. How well do my intuitions for physical stability work if I show you really weird shapes that aren't like the ones you've seen before? We haven't done that formally. There are some games that kind of do that, but I'd love to do that formally. And if anyone wants to work on that, that could be a cool project. My sense from the games that are out there is that there's a little bit of a learning curve, and we have some projects trying to model how you could learn to adapt. Like, what exactly are you learning when you learn about effectively the affordances of novel shapes? But I can't really point to any data on that. I just say that's an interesting open question. Well, again, so I'm not showing this here, but counterfactuals, I would say, our ability to evaluate counterfactuals to say, in the case where this happened, what would have happened? I wouldn't call that about a prior. That's a kind of reasoning that can work on any causal model. It really crucially does involve a causal model. And we've studied, Kevin and others in our lab have studied this stuff. You can study that on these physics models. Toby Gerstenberg, who used to be in our lab and has also taught here, he's like one of the world's experts in that. He's now a professor at Stanford. And you can also do counterfactual reasoning on, I mean, that's actually a really nice thing about these probabilistic programs and mental simulations is I would say they are by far our best models for the substrate of counterfactual reasoning, at least in human thought, and probably in AI too. But beyond the question of, I mean, but you might ask, what about causal and counterfactual reasoning in just sort of arbitrary domains? Like, for example, would the Earth exist if the sun had exploded, or if the sun had exploded 10 billion years ago? Would the Earth still exist? Probably not. Would there be life as we know it? Would humans have evolved if the sun had exploded 10 billion years ago? Yeah, I don't think so. Now, how do I know that? I didn't run a physics simulation like this, but I have some kind of causal knowledge that I can invoke, yeah. So that's a great thing to study. I mean, I've done a little bit of that. I think, you can use the same kind of tools or probabilistic programs and some kind of simulation or of some form to do it. It's just not going to be a game-style physics engine. Although I have to say that the mental picture I have in my head when I think about that looks a lot like that wrecking chain hitting the ball, but only, or maybe it's like Star Wars or something. I don't know. Anyway, and I have done work like that, but I guess maybe about 10 years ago, starting with this intuitive physics stuff, as well as some of the intuitive psychology that I was going to show, I switched to focusing on these core systems, the things that you can study in babies and that also seem to be in these like evolutionarily developed, functionally distinct brain systems like Nancy studies. Hi, Nancy. Nancy Kammerscher is here. I've mentioned some of your work before, but we'll come back to it. Anyway, because it's just, I think, a richer topic. Like, it's not that we don't have a lot of other prior knowledge. It's just that, like, I guess I'd say there's many reasons to start with this. Because it's evolved, there's like really rich structure in there. And I think we have good tools for characterizing it. Because we can study it in babies, children, adults, and also non-human animals, both near neighbors like chimps, farther neighbors like macaques, but also birds or rats, we have a much better hope of characterizing how those priors evolve and develop than knowledge about, the sun exploding, okay? And also, most importantly, because I think you kind of have to get this before you can get that. Because the way we learn about suns and astrophysics or whatever, in 10 billion years, we only can reason about that because we have natural language. My only grasp on the number 10 billion is through the number system which is built in natural language, right? There's no animal who doesn't, including a human, who doesn't have natural language is able to contemplate 10 billion and understand how that's different from 10 million, right? Because, or 10,000, right? I mean, in fact, humans used to be somewhat confused about how old the Earth was. But if I said, if the sun exploded 10,000 years ago, well, that would have been bad for us, but there still would have been humans, because humans existed more than 10,000 years ago. So I'm told. I only know this because somebody told me in English. So, I would say that the right way to study that, the real best way to do that is first understand this stuff, then understand how language builds on this stuff, then understand how you use language to learn about and build culturally the knowledge that lets you do the things you're asking about. But the toolkit or the approach extends exactly to that. And in other work we've done, we've certainly worked on those things. It's just, then you have to just build a lot by hand that I don't really know if we're building it right. So we're just taking it from the ground up. And I think everybody has, or I mean, I think not exclusively, but many researchers will tell you, you have to start somewhere, and what you really need is like some scaling path. So it's, neuroscientists will often start with certain model systems or start with single cells and then go up from there. I'm giving you my scaling path, but there are certainly others. Yeah, so this picture, I was gonna mostly skip this stuff because I want to get to some of the brain stuff and learning, but I can do a little bit of it. By the way, nice to see you. Only after you took off your mask and started talking did I recognize you. So, okay. Although I thought you looked familiar before, but anyway. So I think a key thing that the red and blue case shows, or other things show here, is that efficiency, the only evidence we get are these actions and the context in which they're unfolding. That's the only direct evidence. But it depends on both the goals or the desires, which are unknown, as well as the beliefs. Sometimes we see inefficiency and it's explained by, oh, I guess you have a different goal than I thought, or maybe you don't even know your own goal. Or sometimes it's explained by having a false belief, like the way the blue ball seems to have a false belief about which holes it can fit through, and so it acts inefficiently and doesn't, even though it's faster than the red ball, it never catches it because it tries to keep going through these holes it can't fit through, right? So our assessment of efficiency is based on both of those things. And what I would say is that all of this is a joint probabilistic inference about how efficient your planner is, indeed even what your planning algorithm is. Although I'm not going to show this here, in some recent work by a student named Shen, who works with me and with Vikash Mansinga, we've built now, using probabilistic programming languages, things which actually have different planning algorithms. So you can actually reason about like planning mistakes. That's another thing. Like maybe the inefficiency is just you had the right beliefs and desires, but you just made a mistake. Like you didn't go deep enough in your search tree, or you need to backtrack or something like that, right? So all of those are different sources of efficiency, and by putting them in a probabilistic inference framework, you can make inferences that jointly couple all of these and figure out what's the best explanation, basically. But you have to have a hypothesis space of possible planning algorithms, hypothesis spaces of possible goals, specified perhaps abstractly or vaguely, as well as hypothesis spaces of possible beliefs. I mean, goals are good examples of things where they could be specified very concretely. Like I could have a goal to pick up this mask, but I could also have a goal to just pick up something and I don't know what. If you see somebody reaching for, let's say there's like a cabinet and you can't see into the cabinet, but you see someone reaching into it, it's a good inference that they're reaching for something, but you don't know what, but you have a sense it's probably a medium or small sized object that they could pick up. And partly how you know that is, well, if they reached with both of their hands, maybe it's a bigger object. And you can do that kind of experiment. We've done a little bit of that, right? They're probably reaching for something that's close by, because if it was far away, they would have started off by moving like this. So we can make inferences about goals specified abstractly to handle situations like that, for example. But that's part of the value of having probabilistic inference in a programming language setting, is you can handle all of those things in a very natural way, right? Okay. I think maybe that's just what I'll say about intuitive psychology here, and not show you more about it, in order that I can talk some about the brain and learning. But that's a hard choice for me, because I'm also tempted by the fact that there's one neat thing that I'd like to show you there. Maybe I'll show you this one neat thing, but only this one thing from intuitive psychology. It also partly relates to this issue of conditional efficiency and how it relates to uncertainty about goals and beliefs. So we did this study, which is called, we sometimes call it the food truck study. This was work that was done by Chris Baker and Julian Hara-Enninger, together with Rebecca Sachs and me. Chris is now the chief scientist and the co-founder of a self-driving car company, which initially started under the premise that they'd use these ideas to make better self-driving cars that would understand people's behavior, but it turned out to be more profitable to build a company to navigate around shipping yards and trucks, so that's what they do. But the company is quite successful at what they've been doing. Their name is IC. And then Julian is an academic. He's a professor at Yale, assistant professor there, where he's doing all sorts of really cool things that build on these kinds of ideas. But in this scenario, I'm just going to show you, it's like a very simple, behavioral way to study theory of mind and action understanding in a grounded spatial context that I think illustrates the kinds of things you can do with these models, and ways in which, in some sense, it's even more promising than intuitive physics. So in this scenario here, you have this, it's like many of our university campuses. I don't know where you guys spend your time, but at MIT during at least normal times, maybe future times, you might go to various food trucks to get lunch. The food trucks park in these yellow parking spaces. In different scenes in this world, sometimes there's different parking spaces in different places. Different food trucks can come to campus on different days or park in different places, and that gives you uncertainty, which is important. There's these buildings, like the black squares, the big black square in the middle, that's a building. You can't see around the building, okay? But our grad student, I forget whether their name is Holly or Harry here, we'll find out in a second, or maybe it's neither, comes out from their building, and they can see one parking spot, not the other. Now, in this particular scenario, we have experiments where we mix many different factors up. But in this scenario, there's 3 food trucks that can come to campus on different days, different combinations. There's a Korean truck, K, a Lebanese truck, L, and a Mexican truck. In this case, the student comes out of their office, and they can see the near parking spot. They can see that there's the Korean truck there. They know there's another parking spot on the other side, but they can't see it. We don't know what they know about that. But let's see what they do. So here's what they do. They go around to the other side. I'm showing their path. On the other side, they can now see that the Lebanese truck is there. And then they turn around and go back to the Korean truck. So the question is, a few questions, but one is, what is their favorite truck? How many people say Mexican? How many people say anything else? Lebanese? Korean? Oh yeah. You have to be paying attention. No, it's fine. So the key point is, so I told you that Mexican is one of the trucks that can come to campus, okay? And it's on there. It's okay. There's no blame. I'm glad you asked that question. That's perfect. But the Mexican truck, crucially, is not in the scene. It's only in your head because I told you that that's a truck. That's a possibility. Okay. But the best way to interpret this person's behavior is that their favorite truck is Mexican, and furthermore, it will only make sense if they thought the Mexican truck was there, or maybe thought it might have been there, right? If they knew the Lebanese truck was there, and Mexican was their favorite, then they wouldn't have wasted their time. Oh, that's the other thing is, what's their second favorite truck? Korean. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear, like preference ordering. If Lebanese was their favorite, they would have, once they saw it, they would have just gone there. So you know Korean is their second favorite, but Mexican is their first favorite. And you only know that because of this sort of inefficient path. So this is another way that efficiency, you could say that they didn't take an efficient path to their goal, yet you can explain it by positing, in a sense, a kind of counterfactual. Like, counterfactually, the Mexican truck could have been there, and they must have thought that it might have been, hoped it was, in a sense, right? Another way to put it is, suppose you were to describe what is their emotional state at the time when they got to the other side of the wall and turned around. How would you describe it? I heard disappointed. Did anyone say anything else? Yeah, that's what I would say. Disappointed, right? What does it mean to be disappointed? It means to want something and believe it might be there, and then it turns out you get some experience that it isn't there. Right. So that would be good. That would be a good account, and the way this experiment was set up, and again, I said this a little bit, but it went by fast. That would be good if you didn't know where the parking spaces were. But in this experiment, the people know where the parking spaces are, they just don't know which truck is there on any given day. Does that make sense? So yeah, we could do that too. We could do that experiment. Or we could like get rid of the parking spaces and just, you could do exactly the complement is to say, you get a schedule that tells you which trucks are coming, but you don't know where they are, then you have to go and find them. Yeah, and what we would predict is that people would explain that differently. We haven't done that experiment, but that would be a great project if anyone wants to do a project or something like that. It'd be really cool. Here what we did is we told them the things that I told you, and then we can actually query, oh yeah, this was Holly, we can query both their desire and their initial belief. So on a scale of 1 to 7, how much does she like each truck? That's what you're seeing in the red there. And also, what did she, on a scale of 1 to 7, how much do you think she thought the thing in the other parking space before she saw it? Did she know it was there, or did she have a belief? And in this case, people say, they don't know, but they say it's more likely that she thought it was Mexican than that she thought it was Lebanese or nothing. Because if either, given the inferences about her desires, if she thought it was Lebanese, she wouldn't have gone there. And if she thought there was nothing there, which is also a possibility on some trials, then she also wouldn't have gone there. Okay. So that's just one trial. In the experiment, we have about 80 of them. These are just others, just so you can see the parking spaces are always in the same places, but the accessible routes are different. Who's there is different. So a lot of things kind of change around. And I'm just sort of illustrating, not in detail, the judgments of people and the model, and there's really quite a strikingly good fit. I mean, if we plot this in terms of a scatter plot of correlations, the correlations are even better for this than for intuitive physics in terms of the model fits to people's judgments. And I think that there's a reason for that, which is, first of all, our brains are really good at understanding people's behavior, at least in this context. There's a lot of things that people do which are less efficient, less rational, and mysterious to us. But when it comes to moving around the world to get food, foraging, finding things, strong motivators, which involve all the factors you said, including like one of the factors is how far away is something. If there's something you want and it turns out to be much farther, then yes, it's quite likely you might switch your goal. We understand that very well. Is it because we evolved to have that? Is it because we developed early in life? I don't know, but you can do studies increasingly. A few years ago, I would have said with 10-month-old babies. Now, even with 3-month-old babies, Sherry Liu, who was also a graduate student in CBMM with Liz Spelke and a student and TA here, Sherry in her thesis showed that even 3-month-old babies do this kind of efficiency-based reasoning to make sense of reaching movements. So it does seem to be something really quite fundamental and quite possibly built in. And other animals can do some versions of this, if not quite the same. I'm not saying 3-month-olds can do these inferences which involve positing false beliefs. What's cool about this one, right, is that you do an efficiency-based inference about the goal, but subject to the possibility of a false belief, like thinking the Mexican truck was there when it wasn't. And so you actually are reasoning about inefficiency and not just efficiency. There's no evidence, and probably good evidence, that 3-month-olds don't do that, right? But there's some evidence that 1.5-year-olds can do limited versions of that, and 3- and 4-year-olds can do much more of that. So these are examples of some of the both, what we understand about what might be built in and something about what might develop. Okay. Any questions about this stuff? Again, if you want to scale this up to something like this, I'm not really going to show you how to do it, but if you want to capture like what's going on in that scene, what has to be going on inside his head or in our heads when we watch it, you can take the same tools, but actually combine them recursively. So if you want to say, what does it mean to be helpful as that kid is being there, or as like this is a scene where somebody's reaching for something on a tabletop. That's Yibao and Tao. The guy reaching is Yibao. He's the CEO of that self-driving car company I told you about. And Tao, who was also a member of CBMM, is now a professor at UCLA. He's the guy reaching. How do we look at the scene and we know that even though Yibao is doing some weird thing like reaching over a piece of glass, he has a certain goal and Tao sees it and tries to help him, as opposed to like this scene down here, where Tao seems to be reaching for something and someone else, who happens to be his wife, is not trying to help him, but the opposite, trying to get in his way or hinder him. Or how do we recognize helping there? Well, we've built models of this, which I'm not going to go into detail on, but Tomer Ullman and Chris Baker had a paper 10 years ago studying this, where, and we've tested this also with babies even, actually. 10-month-old babies do some form of this reasoning. Kylie Hamlin with Tomer showed that. But basically there's a sort of recursive notion of helping, where what it means to be helpful is to act with a utility function. I didn't even go into any of the math, but the math of like efficiency is all about what we call a utility calculus, or a naive utility calculus. That's Julian's term for it. And sorry, I'm totally mangling my story, but if you want, probably the best review of it is Julian's review, which was the one that was on this slide here. If you want to learn more about this, check out Julian et al.'s Trends in Cognitive Science review on this naive utility calculus. But this basic idea that we can capture efficient action in terms of rewards for getting to goals and costs of action, and then plans are trying to maximize expected utility. That's the math of how all these models work. And then you can make that recursive, where you can have agents who act to maximize utilities which they believe, or which depend on their beliefs about another agent's utility. So if I make my belief about your utility function a positive component of my own utility, that's a very general abstract way to be helpful, right? I still have to figure out what your utility is, but I just decide whatever your utility is, that's kind of going to be part of mine. That's like the golden rule in a sense, or sometimes called the platinum rule, which is even better than golden rule. And we can build models that instantiate that idea. Or what does it mean to be hindering, or to be competitive with someone? Maybe it's to have the opposite, to actually have positive utility when they get negative utility. Okay? So the best way we have to build abstract models of how we understand those kinds of multi-agent interactions uses these recursively composed efficient agent planning models. And again, we want to talk about why do we want not just a probabilistic model, but a probabilistic programming language. There's really no other way in general to build these kind of models without something like a programming language where you can have an agent that has recursive beliefs and desires about other agents. So if I want to say, to be helpful, I have to say, I'm taking as part of my desire, my belief about your desire. I could be wrong. I could be trying to be helpful, but failing. That's the plot of many comedies and tragedies. But if I want to understand how that works, then I need to be able to have beliefs and desires about beliefs and desires. And a probabilistic programming language gives you a way to do that. And basically, no other way does. So you were asking, one of you guys over here was asking about symbols, and what do I mean by symbols? Well, partly what I mean is symbolic expressions of beliefs and desires that can express the idea of beliefs and desires about other beliefs. You know, if I want to say, express my belief about your desire and make that part of my desire, then I need some symbolic representation of that. Yeah, I mean, this has been a long-term project. I wish I could point you to a published paper on this. We have a submitted paper that reflects this, but through various people going to be faculty and others starting companies, as I referred to, it's taken us a while to really deliver on this. But what we've been working on for a while is taking these models and doing this. So this is a prototype from few years ago, where you see somebody reaching for something and you're trying to infer what are they reaching for. And at some point, about halfway through this video, just watch it one more time, you can figure out what she's reaching for. You can't tell initially. So, you can't tell initially what she's reaching for, but, maybe around now, you have a pretty good confidence, right? So you might have noticed that I just saw it at the back of my head, I think. When I said now, I was looking at the video and just trying to be a subject in the experiment. But around that time, this dashed line shot up. That's the prediction of a model. What it's doing is it's looking at the video, it's interpreting her action using a robotics model. We use this Mujoko physics engine, which is a standard tool in robotic motion planning, but we can use it as the planner and then invert it. We can say, so this is a tool that allows me to give a humanoid robot model a goal, like touch this thing, and have physical costs. So the costs of action are something like the motor torques, or just some model of how much energy it takes to move your body. And then we say what it means to be efficient is to move your body in a generally efficient way to achieve your goal. These robotic physics engines can be used to plan really interesting, complex behaviors. Emo Todorov developed Mujoko, and some of my favorite work of all time, but certainly in robotics, is work that he and Igor Mordach and other colleagues did, which showed how to do basically physics-based trajectory optimization using forerunners of Mujoko that allow robots to plan really complex goal-directed things like sitting on or standing on a chair in order to change a light bulb or something like that. And you basically just say, do the optimally efficient thing, and these tools can do that to some extent. We can then basically run that backwards or make Bayesian inferences about what source of reward, which object, if it were your goal and you would get reward for touching it, would best explain the observed action, assuming you were doing some approximate physics-based optimization. And that's how this model works. And it can do a pretty good job of predicting behavior in these cases, but not only in these cases, also in some of these more complex cases, like this one, where somebody's reaching over a weirder way of reaching, where somebody's reaching over a constraint. You're not reaching on a direct path, but you can still figure out that okay, well, the best explanation if you're trying to be physically efficient with the robotics model is that you're reaching for this object or that object. So that's the thing we have in this paper, which I'm happy to share with you. I still don't think it's the best evidence of this. It's one of these things that's under review at NeurIPS, and it's right on the borderline. So it deserves to get in, but it also deserves to get rejected, honestly. No, I mean, just because it's a really competitive conference. So maybe this will get in, and then I'll finally be able to say, look, we have this paper, but it might just need more work, because it's very hard to get these models in the psychophysics to work, and we just haven't had the personnel in our lab to do it. But Yingdong, who's together with Tao and Marta, have basically a bunch of people just working in their spare time have done a really nice job on this project. It's just been slow going. But I think if more robotics people, increasingly robotics people are really quite interested in this idea. So at MIT, Julie Shaw, or at Berkeley, Anka Dragan, or Dorsa at Stanford, her former student, they're very interested and have developed things that are somewhat similar to this. So I think more and more robotics people will do this kind of thing, and I think the more they do, the more we can develop. It's slow for us because it's just very hard engineering work, but the people who are really good at doing this engineering work, part of why I talk about this is to inspire them to do more of this, because I think it's totally doable, right? I mean, if we invested $80 billion in this instead of in whatever the self-driving car industry is doing, it would be, this problem is totally solvable. Okay, so good question, long answer, I hope that helps. I'm gonna basically skip through some neuroscience, but I will just show, as Nancy will go into, you guys were asking me about functional brain systems that do this, and through work, largely from Nancy and her students and collaborators, people like Rebecca Sachs or their joint student Ben Dean, or Leila Ifsik, who is also a longtime TA and postdoc and a person here in summer school. Is Leila here this year? Is she coming later? Okay. It's really like sort of our best CBMM family effort is a lot of the work that we've done here. And maybe Nancy will talk about that, but if she won't, I don't know, a little bit. Okay, well, that's all I was going to do was talk about it a little bit too. So I'll let you show those couple of slides. But to answer the questions of people on the neuro side, or Tommy might be wondering, like, how do you study these things in neural circuits? The general program is first find the parts of the brain where these happen. The physics engine, well, I don't want to steal Nancy's thunder because then she really won't talk about it. But we find the parts of the brain. Turns out they're very interesting parts. Then we can actually record from neurons in those parts of the brain. And we can to a limited extent study their representations in fMRI. But the future is really recording from neurons either in human brains, intracranially, or from non-human primates. And then, testing neural models of intuitive physics. And we've been working on those kind of things too. I won't go into the details, but I would just say the one thing we've learned, if you want to build a neural circuit type model of the kind of intuitive physics, the one thing you have to do is, don't do these kinds of things like I showed you in that Facebook thing, or like in this early work from Ilya Sutskever and Jeff Hinton. Don't use a ConvNet style distributed representation. You have to use, and pretty much everybody will agree with this in neural networks, some kinds of basic symbols. And I think this is important to highlight because, again, it gets at some of these issues of symbols in the brain. The best neural networks, and really the only neural networks that anybody's been able to build that can capture intuitive physics, they're built on something called graph neural networks, which is this. These are examples of neural physics engines, like learned neural type circuits that do intuitive physics, that can simulate like bouncing balls and all the kind of stuff we've been talking about. The key is that unlike like a convolutional neural net, which starts off with pixels and then finds patterns in that defined in image space, these are built on top of graphs and they have distinct nodes for objects. So there's one node in the graph for each object, and there's edges in the graph for the interactions between them, like for forces and contact. So in some sense, it kind of builds in the qualitative discrete structure of objects and physical force interactions. But it learns how those interactions work. It actually, in a sense, builds in the algebra that you have in F equals ma from Newtonian physics, and then learns, in a sense, the particular ways that like mass and forces operate. What I mean by the interactions is, remember, when you learn F equals ma, that's the slogan everybody learns, but what's the actual kind of algebraic form of Newton's second law? It's really more like sum over F divided by M equals A. If by equal you mean like a causal arrow, right? So the causal version is you take all the forces incident on an object, you sum them up as vectors, you divide by the mass, and that's the acceleration vector. And those forces, at least in the simplest versions of Newtonian mechanics, are pairwise forces, like whether it's gravity or other things. So you simplify the world by assuming there's these discrete entities and pairs of things can interact, and they have vector forces that are hidden, and you sum those up and divide by the mass. And if you look at the way these graph neural networks, like interaction networks from Battaglia et al. At DeepMind, or Michael Chang, who did this really cool work when he was an undergrad at MIT with us, what he called the neural physics engine, they all use the same basic structure where you have a graph on pairs of objects. Each pair has a vector that basically learns to represent the forces. And then you also have a vector which represents the properties of each object, that it can include mass, elasticity, friction, other object-specific properties. And you sum up those first vectors and then run them through another function with the other one. So it doesn't know about dividing, but it basically says, take the sum of these things you could call f and run it through another nonlinear function together with something that you could call m, and then that produces explicitly the acceleration, namely it's the time step change in positions and velocities. So it builds in, I would say, all the abstractions of classical mechanics, even just Newtonian physics, but it learns how the forces work and what properties matter. And I think that's an interesting example of how you could build something like a neural network that captures intuitive physics. And pretty much everybody who's building neural physics models uses some variant of that idea. Yes, so Michael Chang didn't show this, but in another student project, the first author was named David Zhang, I think. I didn't I worked a little bit on that project. Tomer Ullman and I supervised that, and I'm trying to remember. There was another author, but David was the first author. Anyway, they showed how you could use this to also infer the mass implicitly. So you infer these vectors which then correlate with mass or other properties. Okay. So does this correspond to how the brain works? We don't know. But these are at least possibly testable hypotheses, although they, I mean, in the same way that other neural network models could be testable. They raise some key challenges, though, which is nobody knows how a neural population implements a graph. So one of the real challenges, and this, I'll end pretty soon, but just one of the challenges for computational neuroscience that this work raises, that some of our colleagues are trying to solve, for example, in particular, Dan Yeamans, who is a professor at Stanford, but used to be here at MIT and works with a number of us. We worked together with him to try to understand how might these neural physics models be implemented in the brain. And the real challenge that he and others are trying to solve is how do you map one of these graph structured neural networks where there's one node for each abstract object into like a fixed neural population. Nobody knows how that works, but that's at least we can articulate that as a challenge, a question that's both a theoretical question and an empirical question. So I hope we can make progress on that. And to people who are wondering, like Tommy, I'm trying to anticipate your question because there's not much time. How does this work in neurons? This is a way, at least, that we can start to take this top-down approach and make contact with the brain. And we're lucky that we have several physiology labs, including Jim DiCarlo's lab, Mehrdad Jazaeri's lab, Vinrik Friewald's lab, as part of CBMM. They're all interested in basically testing these kind of models now that we know where to look. And Mehrdad Jazaeri's lab at MIT has, and he's, I think recently, is Mehrdad part of CBMM now, Tommy? Has he joined? Mehrdad? Oh, okay. Mehrdad, if you're watching this, we should have asked you a long time ago. Anyway, Mehrdad's doing some of the most interesting work on studying exactly these kinds of things in macaque monkeys and humans, and has really nice models that sort of capture the behavior and that start to also kind of compile these things into like recurrent neural networks, so you could study the actual neural dynamics. Anyway, so it's a really active research program that I think you'll start to see coming out of some of these neuroscience labs in the near future. We should mostly wrap up. I was going to talk about learning. Since I can't really do that, I'll at least just sort of tell you the kind of thing I would tell you, or what the open questions are. The key, as I think you've already seen, right, is that the version of learning that we're talking about, different from the version of learning that you might see in a lot of, quote, deep learning or reinforcement learning stuff. Like, for example, here's some other, I mentioned Dan Yeamans a minute ago. He has often pursued this sort of more like, call it blank slate approach. I think he's been a bit persuaded that he shouldn't do this anymore. But like in some earlier work he did a few years ago with Nick Haber and Fei and Damien Mrauka, they built a kind of simple kind of curiosity-based baby-like learning system that really starts off with nothing more than some convolutional neural networks, but over time, by kind of exploring how it moves things around, kind of develops some aspects of object-based attention. And if you thought that infants learn how to attend to objects or pick out objects, then this might be a good model. But our best evidence is that at least some aspects of object cognition are already built in, and this system, I think Dan would be the first to tell you that this should be redone, but with a more of that object stuff built in. And indeed, that's now what his group is working on, and we collaborate on these things. But still, the approach that I guess I favor is more to build in a lot more, to build in the kinds of things that are built into game engines, and then do all these other kinds of learning. So learn inside the game engine, learn on top of the engine, maybe learn the engine itself. So that means like start with a proto-game engine, some parts of it, and learn and extend it. And then, as I alluded to, you can use these foundations to learn everything else by building language on top of that. So there's lots of different ways to do this, right? Like I mentioned, if you want to learn inside the game engine, you can show people scenes like these sort of little air hockey tables where they have unusual physics, like things magnetically attract or repel each other, or there's weird other latent properties like sticky patches. And Tomer Ullman, who did this work a few years ago, showed how you can basically do a kind of hierarchical Bayesian inference to very quickly infer these parameters in ways that roughly fit with people's judgments. Or in some work that I'll just point you to that Kelsey Allen and Kevin Smith over there did, I would call this learning on top of the game engine. That was like learning to estimate new physical forces inside the game engine. Learning on top means learning like how to use the game engine to solve problems and learning strategies for physical problem solving. So kind of inspired by this idea that people, like those birds I showed you before, are very flexible tool users. If you find yourself out camping and you left at home, forgot at home, your hammer to pound in your stakes, you still want to pound in your tent stakes. You might consider other objects you could find that you could use to pound in the stakes, and you might quickly rule out ones that don't have the right physical properties, like the pine cone or maybe the stick, and then try these hard things. You might try this stone here, but then realize, no, that's not going to work. You need something, I don't know, kind of longer. And even if you don't know words like lever or whatever, you need something longer, and then you can pound this thing in, for example. So they built this really cool scenario or world for studying how we use our intuitive physics to solve problems, which is called the virtual tools game. This is just a demo of it. I'm not going to show you any more, but just you can check out their virtual tools paper, which actually is no longer in press because it was published in 2020. Sorry, this slide is old. But you can play this game online. Kevin can show it to you. It's a really cool way to study how you can use your simulation engine in your head to model physical problem solving and even build like abstract strategies on top of that. Strategies like if you want to learn about catapulting, for example. This is some recent work that they haven't published yet. But like, how do I recognize all these different things, not the whisk or the hammer, but how do I recognize like all these different kinds of things as catapults? Even that's a catapult. Or in our tools game, you might have saw someone dropping something and kind of catapulting another thing. So they show how to basically learn a logical program description on top of a physics engine that is a kind of way of using a simple kind of symbolic language of thought to capture this notion of catapulting. So I'm flashing through these slides only to show you, to point to what does learning on top of a game engine look like. Part of what it looks like is learning that kind of thing. So symbolic descriptions of the abstract concept of catapulting, which this system can learn from a little bit of experience in just a few scenarios, and then generalize and use that program which captures the concept of catapulting. Something like take a large object, find a supporting surface and a fulcrum, and place this thing like high enough up above one side of the lever object. That's a way of describing it in words. And this model is able to learn that concept, at least in a simple form, and capture people's abstract strategies. The last kind of learning, maybe the most interesting kind of learning in intuitive physics, is actually like building out your mental simulator, right? So could you build a system which takes some experience through some combination of its own lifetime and maybe evolution also, and the input is scenes and what happens, and the output is one of these physics simulators. This is probably the hardest problem because your learning algorithm has to be like an algorithm whose output is another algorithm, right? The simulator is a program. We can do probabilistic inference on it using probabilistic programming. But if you want a learning algorithm whose output is a program, it has to be a program that learns programs, right? In a sense, it's like it's code that writes other code. So there was a phrase up there before which I didn't say, but I'll say now, which is this idea. We sometimes call it the child is coder or the child is hacker. Around MIT, hacking is not a bad thing. Like to most of the people out there, if I talk about hackers, you think like the bad guys who break into your email and steal your credit cards. But as probably many of you know, at MIT, hacking is a cool thing. Hacking is like in the context of coding, like just curiosity based, like just cool, making your code more awesome or whatever. Or just in general sort of playful exploration, but especially in the world of code. So the problem that we're trying to solve, if we're trying to make algorithms that learn algorithms or programs that build like simulation programs, is effectively this kind of problem. Unlike learning in a neural network where there's a smooth weight space and you can do gradient descent, in the space of code, there isn't any nice smooth structure. There's not any nice geometry and often not even any nice topology. It's a much rougher landscape. You can't just go downhill or uphill. Yet somehow children, or some combination of evolution and child development, is able to effectively do this, to search through the space of possible programs, like a physics simulation programs, and build really good ones. Now we know, as I've spent a while talking about before, the game industry did this, right? Like over a few decades, humans collectively built these things that we call physics engines or game engines. And it was really a cultural evolution process. There were a few key people, but there was a lot of other people who contributed, and probably no one person would have done it on their own. Okay. And the conjecture is that evolution did something like that, or some combination of evolution and development. And if we want to talk about the aspects of learning that a human does, especially when I say, like, how do I learn new physical forces, or how do I learn about kinds of physics that didn't exist before, I have to actually be modifying my code. So this is the hard problem. And we don't have an answer to this, but we can at least sort of start to formulate it. This is a really general idea, and I'm really excited about it because I think this is really the future of learning, both in AI and in cognitive science. And that's what's summed up in this recent opinion piece called "The Child as Hacker" by Josh Rule and Steve Piantadosi and myself. Josh was a recent graduate from our group at MIT and BCS. And it's this idea that, like, sort of the most general way to think about knowledge is some kind of code, and then learning is just making your code more awesome. It's not just intuitive physics, but think about all these different domains of human knowledge that people individually and collectively learn, right? There's really only one, like, formal representation that can capture all of them, and that's some kind of programming language, some kind of code. And that doesn't just mean individual programs, but it's sometimes a programming language. Like, if I want to say, what do I learn when I learn music? Or what do I learn when I learn how to talk about kinship systems? Or if I learn a scientific theory, like the theory of Mendelian genetics or relativity. Or if I learn a social system. In each case, you might say, I'm not just learning code, but I'm learning, like, a whole domain-specific programming language that describes the concepts and the functions that are operative in that domain. And there are ways to formalize this, which this is what I don't have time to tell you about. But this is, I think, some of the most exciting work that people are starting to do is to build learning algorithms that do all these kinds of things. These are all things that you do when you're hacking on your code to make it more awesome. So, these are all different activities of coding and improving code. The top one is what we normally do in machine learning, like in neural networks, which is we tune the parameters of existing code. We don't really modify the program. We just write a fixed program and tune its parameters. That's like what you do with gradient descent in a TensorFlow program. But there's lots of other things that you do when you're writing the code, modifying functions, debugging, maybe writing new functions, or even writing whole new libraries or languages that you can then reuse to solve new problems. Like, that's how we got TensorFlow and PyTorch. Those are languages, but before that, there were libraries that Jan LeCun wrote in a language called Lush, or maybe Lua, and he wrote Lush. I don't know the history. And then that became Torch, and that became PyTorch. But basically, he wrote some macros, and then he wrote these libraries, and then some of his students wrote a whole programming language, and then other really expert programming language people wrote whole new programming languages that are now really good. And it came because companies like Google, ultimately, Google and Facebook, invested not $80 billion, but many millions of dollars in the engineering teams to take those early pieces of code and make them into whole languages. So what I think is the future of both models of human learning, as well as, I think, more human-like models of machine learning, are algorithms that can do all these kinds of things, that can learn by writing code, by writing domain-specific libraries of code that capture domains of knowledge, and then writing whole programming languages. And that's mostly in the future, but if you're curious, I'll just advertise a recent paper from Kevin Ellis, who was another graduate of our group, he was advised by me and also by Armando Solar-Lezama, who's a programming languages person at MIT, and one of the world's experts in what's called program synthesis, which didn't used to be about machine learning, but it's basically using techniques of symbolic code manipulation to get machines to automatically write code. And what Kevin did in this really cool work that you can read about on arXiv, I'll just advertise the paper, is he built a system which combines, like, programming language techniques as well as some hierarchical Bayesian inference to infer what's effectively a domain-specific library that captures knowledge in any one of these domains that forms a prior. It literally forms a hierarchical Bayesian prior, but it takes the form of a probabilistic programming language, basically. And there's even a little bit of neural networks in there. It's called Dreamcoder because, inspired by that idea of Jeff Hinton's that I told you about a while ago, the wake-sleep algorithm, this system is a kind of wake-sleep algorithm. During its waking phase, it solves problems, but during its sleeping phases, it actually does two kinds of things. One is it forms new abstractions, like compiling out abstractions, as some people have suggested go on in sleep, to basically reformulate things in qualitative ways. But it also, in the wake-sleep original form, draws samples from its generative model of problems that it can use to train a neural network that guides the symbolic algorithms in their search problem. So remember I showed you that really bad search landscape. Symbolic search for code is, there's no nice gradient structure. But you can train a neural network to kind of approximately guide your way through it, kind of like if you know about AlphaGo or AlphaZero, it's much like the way the neural network there learns to guide a symbolic tree search through the space of Go moves. You can do the same thing through the space of ways of changing your code. And the combination of all these things works in really cool ways. So I'll just say, if you're interested in how that works, check out the Dreamcoder paper. And with that, I will mostly just sort of conclude with one vision slide and one just words. So, I focused on this. How do we learn that core knowledge stage? But as I told you a few times, the real trajectory is this one. Once you can capture what you know about intuitive physics, intuitive psychology, and how you learn that, then you can talk about the most important next thing that every child learns, at least in most societies right now, is language and how to not only talk, but how to read and write. And it's learning that then allows you to access all the other knowledge that can't be built into your brain or learned from your own direct experience playing with things in the world, all the knowledge that builds culturally across generations and even across cultures. And that's the real sort of singularity of human intelligence, is that part, right? That's the stuff that is not shared with other animals. And if you want to say, when are we going to have AI that might actually achieve something like human intelligence? My best bet, it's not the only bet, but I would say the best bet is if we were to follow this scaling route. Because I think if we look in the natural world, it's the only existence proof we have. In the known universe, this is the only example of a learning machine that reliably grows into human intelligence starting from much less. So the idea that we might build something like that by reverse engineering this process, it's not the only way to do it. But I would bet if we spent $80 billion on this, our picture of AI would look very different. So that's where I want to leave you. I would say, and this is where, especially part of CBMM going forward, this is one of our main activities that I'm personally invested in and helping to lead, is trying to do this, trying to take all the ingredients you've seen here and our best understanding of what is the starting state and what are the learning algorithms that actually go beyond that. What we've learned so much beyond what Turing knew when he first suggested this kind of idea, learned about the science of what is there, but also some of the engineering constructs that are needed to express those scientific discoveries and insights in engineering terms. So we put these ideas together, these game engine style things with probabilistic programs, and these ideas which I could only just tell you a little bit about at the end, about program induction and program synthesis. And we think it gives us a roadmap and a path to follow. We'll see where we get. I'm sure it won't be enough. I'm sure there'll be other things that we need. But as I think you can see, we're starting to make some progress, and it's really exciting. So I hope if you're interested in this, whether over the next week or two or longer term, we'll be in touch, and we'll find ways to work together. Okay, thanks.